All eyes are on the Democratic Unionist Party now, following the government's announcement of the Windsor framework. This is the new EU-UK agreement on trading relations between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We won't go through all of the details of how that changes the trading relationship, because I'm sure our listeners will have caught up on a lot of that. But we want to know what happens next. So the DUP leader, Jeffrey Donaldson, he's been fairly nuanced in his response to it compared to sort of stauncher figures in his party and also the harder line voices of the traditional Unionist voice party. And the Tory Brexiteers response as well has been generally quite positive. There was glowing coverage in the right-wing press that are usually trying to make trouble for Rishi Sunak and sort of support Boris Johnson's line. Although some Tory MPs are saying that they would only vote through this new arrangement with the DUP's backing. So we're waiting to hear what they say. Donaldson has said it will take as long as it takes. But Freddie, is it a triumph anyway for Sunak, even if, power sharing doesn't return to Northern Ireland, just because he's managed to, sort out this legal framework for implementing the protocol without creating the huge divisions in his party that his predecessors have?
Yeah, definitely. I think you have to recognise, first of all, that it is a much better deal than what Boris Johnson got. That's why people are quite positive about it. And also, it's something that many people thought that the EU wouldn't concede and was actually seen as an impossibility. More broadly, I think we've got to recognise that this is a massive improvement in the EU-UK relationship. I think it's the biggest improvement since 2016. It's really changed the tone, the tenor of that relationship. And you're going to see that bleed through into other policy areas. We've already seen the EU start talking about the UK joining the Horizon Scientific Research Programme. It means, some MPs, I think this is quite hopeful, but some MPs are now pointing towards whether this will help the UK government get a deal with France. We've got the French UK summit coming up soon on the small boats crisis in the Channel, that is. So there are broader implications of this deal beyond the politics. But I think you are right that Stormont now is where all eyes should be focused. We already know that the deal is probably going to get through Parliament because Labour have said that they're going to support it. So I think the ERG is really important in terms of party unity and whether the deal, comes across well to Tory party members and things like that. But we know it's going to get through. So I think eyes should really be on the DUP and on Stormont and how they react and whether they will return to the executive.
Yeah. And what is their incentive for returning to the executive? Because, of course, if they did so, then they'd risk, riling up some of their more, hardline base. And also, of course, it would mean a Sinn Féin First Minister.
Yeah, and that's one of the main considerations that's been on their mind for a while. And then also we've got the groups like the TUV and other parties who are on the right of the DUP, and there's local elections coming up and other pressures on them to take a hard line. A few people this week have pointed to the fact that the Stormont break, which is a part of the deal which gives Stormont, the Northern Ireland Assembly, some sort of veto, although it's reliant on the UK and there's still ECJ jurisdiction, all these things. So some sort of veto, some sort of say on whether new EU regulations can come into effect in Northern Ireland. That is only implementable if Stormont sitting. So that's one incentive. But also I think more broadly, and this is the key thing with Northern Ireland, we have to recognise that when there is no government, decisions aren't being made. The NHS in Northern Ireland is one of the worst states throughout the country. So there's lots of consequences for there not being a government. And that's probably the main thing that'll be playing on the mind of MLAs.
Yes, and the only way that, Rishi Sunak or any other Tory minister can claim that they're sort of true, proud unionists is if they're working towards getting power sharing back up and running because of those reasons that you say. I think I've said it on this podcast before, but I was once speaking to an academic who's been speaking to people on low incomes across the country about what their main asks would be from government. And one of the top was getting Northern Ireland government back, which, we forget what this means for the day-to-day lives of the people living there. Rachel, does this nevertheless, bolster Sunak's standing in his party? Whatever happens next, he has shown that you can do, sort of old-fashioned diplomacy, having a warmer relationship with the EU, perhaps fewer noises off to the press, and actually, get something out of them that perhaps, many people who have been long-time commentators on the Brexit negotiations thought that the UK government wouldn't be able to get out of them.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it can be chalked up as a significant achievement for Rishi Sunak. It's interesting that they're talking up quite a lot the way that the EU was prepared to do a deal with Rishi Sunak as opposed to Boris Johnson, because they're saying that that's because the EU felt they could trust Rishi Sunak an awful lot more. They felt like his government was a lot more stable than Boris Johnson's and a lot less divisive in that, he's willing to set aside the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. which would have kind of
Yes.
unilaterally pulled out of all arrangements in Northern Ireland if the UK didn't get what it wanted. So I think Rishi Sunak's quite happy for people to make that comparison with Boris Johnson. I think we're still waiting to see what Johnson's response is, and it seems like, well, the Times is reporting this morning that he will kind of be critical of the deal but ultimately be prepared to back it. And I think that's quite telling, and that does really empower him, because that's been the sort of story of his premiership, this Boris Johnson Rishi Sunak rivalry. And I think if he can kind of have vanquished his foe, which is, he's been kind of, whatever you think of Boris Johnson, he's a very effective campaigner, and he's certainly still attractive to an awful lot of Conservatives. So I think if Rishi Sunak can say that he's defeated Boris Johnson in some way, then I think it will go on to empower him massively.
Yeah. And does that make it tricky for Starmer? I mean, a lot of his attack lines are based on the idea of Sunak being weak. And he actually said in a recent PMQs that he was sort of in hock to the malcontents and wreckers on his backbenches, in terms of trying to hammer a Brexit deal through. Does it mean that they have to slightly recalibrate their attack on Sunak? Or is it, as Freddie, I think you've written, not something that's necessarily going to capture the imagination of voters in Great Britain, even if, globally it's been seen as quite a significant development?
Yeah, I think now we can sort of turn to the politics of it, and the politics aren't as big and large as the deal itself. I don't think it's going to have a massive effect on Rishi Sunak's standing. He might get a few points for competence, being an effective leader. It might help his approval ratings a little bit, because before this, he had this aura of aimlessness that he couldn't really get rid of, and now he's actually achieved something. This is also the first achievement of his premiership. However, the sad reality is, the brutal truth is that most people in Great Britain do not care about Northern Ireland. Yeah. And we've seen that as a trend throughout the Brexit campaign. We've seen it since then. It's not been at the front and centre of people's minds, and polls are showing that people wouldn't be that bothered, or increasingly wouldn't be that bothered, if Northern Ireland left the United Kingdom. So I think in terms of people's perceptions of the government, this won't make a massive difference. The key thing for people at the moment, and we've spoken about this 100 times, is the economy, it's inflation, it's the NHS. These are the things that are going to dominate the next election, and that they're playing on people's minds. It's not trade negotiations with the EU.
Yeah, and actually I've heard from a source privy to Labour's relationship with the EU that actually they'll be pretty happy that this deal was done before they potentially come into government next time, because they've gotten it out of the way, and then they can focus on the other things that they want to do to further improve the UK's relationship with the EU. And that wasn't someone from Labour telling me that, so it's not just spin. Rachel, what are you hearing?
I think the New Statesman's already reported that a Labour government will be prepared to do sector by sector deals with the EU, and over time, improve the UK's relationship with the bloc on certain different sectors. But I think it's probably worth saying that the Labour Party has also done an awful lot of work with its sister parties in the EU and further afield, kind of thinking about how their governments are working, what measures they're putting in place, kind of what kind of subsidies they're offering to in terms of industry and green power going forward. So I think all those things are worth taking into consideration.
Freddie, will they have to drop the line that Sunak's weak?
I think they'll definitely have to drop it this week. I mean, I thought PMQs yesterday was the least exciting, least interesting, least important one we've seen in a while. Sunak was much more strident. He had a buoyancy about him. Starmer wasn't as effective, and that's fine. I think it was just, that was a pause on normal politics, because we had this overarching constitutional news. More broadly, though, I think for Labour, they're going to have to drop the Make Brexit Work slogan. I mean, maybe they'll keep it, but it's not going to be as prominent as it has been, because obviously the main problem, the main thing that they were talking about has now been fixed or will be fixed. But having said that, it was never that front and centre for them anyway. I mean, I think they said, as Rachel points out, they said they want a closer relationship with the EU on many different things. That's always been their policy. But they weren't going to voters like, look, if you elect us, we're going to do this. It relates to what we were just saying. It's not the key thing. Instead, Keir Starmer's taken the language of Brexit, the emotion of Brexit, and turned it into something to do with devolution through the Take Back Control bill, completely unrelated to the EU. That's wise, because as we always say, people didn't vote for Brexit because of trade negotiations or veterinary agreements or anything like this.
I would agree with most of what Freddie said there. I think I don't know if they'll necessarily be dropping make Brexit work, because I think, there are still wider concerns about how Brexit's been hitting the economy, and, there'll still certainly be no shortage of criticism from, people who campaign for Remain and are very, very committed to getting the UK to be as close to the EU as possible. So I don't think they'll necessarily drop that slogan, but I think they'll probably use it in a more broader sense, I suspect.
Yeah, and we can't forget that actually, certain things that are happening day to day in our lives are, sometimes tangentially, sometimes directly related to Brexit. So I've been writing this week about the shortage of salad vegetables in our supermarkets, which is actually something that, EU officials were discussing behind the scenes, thinking, the British public may be distracted by the deal from this shortage, but it's likely that it will carry on for weeks just because our supply chains have been disrupted by Brexit. It takes longer to get those kind of products over the channel than it used to. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch more videos that are on the screen now.